All right, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. This is a presentation called Marijuana, What Every Parent Should Know. It's an educational workshop. And my name is James White. I'm from the California Health Collaborative, and I work with the Performing Above the High project. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the California Health Collaborative is a nonprofit. We're a statewide agency, and we're committed to bettering the quality of life of Californians, particularly those that are underserved and underrepresented. So our program does a number of different services throughout the state. We have our sister program, the Lock It Up Project, that does prescription drug abuse prevention. And then we have a number of things listed here, but we do sexual health and child abuse prevention, tobacco control in a large scale, nutrition, diabetes prevention, all sorts of things like that. So my program is called Performing Above the High, and we are tasked with decreasing marijuana use amongst the 10 to 25-year-old population in Fresno County. So we do that through a number of different means. We have educational presentations and evidence-based curriculum that we use. We go around the county and we go to community events. We host our own events, evidence-based events like Reality Tour, and we host a youth summer camp that deals with youth leadership and prevention there. Many different things like that. Okay, so just kind of continuing with the overview. We were funded in 2011 as a comprehensive approach to marijuana use prevention, again with a 10 to 25 population. And we do lots and lots of community outreach and education. That's kind of our main goal. But we also do work in policy and youth leadership and advocacy. We have a large parent engagement campaign that we utilize where we have parent presentations that we do. We also do parent media campaigns, and we try to reach them in a number of different ways because often that's the best way to reach youth. And then we collaborate with law enforcement on some of the events that we plan and actually have law enforcement come and train some of our youth on their end of things. Like I mentioned, we do school-based education with evidence-based drug prevention curriculum. And then we have many partnerships and collaborations that we do, particularly with our adult advisory board that we host quarterly. So we kind of start off with a quote from the CDC, but the teen years are a time of rapid growth, exploration, and the onset of risk-taking. Taking risks with new behaviors provides kids and teens the opportunity to test their skills and abilities and discover who they are. So what we do in marijuana prevention has a number of different concerns. And as a parent as well, I have these kind of same concerns as well with raising my two young children. But basically, we're talking about youth community perception. So the way that marijuana is viewed, both on a local and a national scale, is a really big part of what we do. And obviously, marijuana perception has become more and more favorable over the years. And now it's somewhere in the 60% range where people are in favor of marijuana legalization. We have huge issues and concerns with access, where youth seem to be very easily able to access marijuana, even for youth that maybe don't seem to know how. It wouldn't be difficult for them to figure out. And so that's a big issue that I would be taking seriously as a parent. And then just general acceptance. Obviously, there's a positive perception. And so having acceptance of marijuana as a part of kind of daily norms and culture is something that influences youth to use as well. So we also are concerned about an increase in e-cigarette use and vaping marijuana. That's been on the rise lately and particularly has spiked in the last year or two. And then tobacco and marijuana marketing and advertising is big. With the youth that we work with, we find that even ones that don't necessarily follow different channels and people on social media outlets that are using a lot of tobacco and marijuana, they still are inundated with different ads and videos and whatnot of these kinds of substances. So social determinants of health, these are something that really is indicative of the way that substance use portrays itself in our society. So there's a number of different things, and I'm not going to necessarily cover every single one of them, and there's many more than this. But regarding these, people are more and less likely to use, depending on if they're positive or negative, based on, say, safe housing and local food markets. Sometimes people grow up without safe housing, without food around, and these things can contribute to just the stress of daily life and their likelihood to use drugs later on. Not having good access to educational, economic, and job opportunities can also be a huge factor. Not having healthcare services, that can be something that is related to youth, where they might say that they self-medicate with marijuana or vaping because they don't have access to health services. And sometimes that's the way that they go about it, is there's drugs on hand, there's not clinics and doctor's offices on hand, and that's one way that they can sort of do that. Quality of education and job training is another big one. Not having transportation options, public safety, and social support. And a lot of this is all just related to stress. Stress has a direct link with substance use. So this is a big part of it. Something that's really been a hot topic lately, and certainly an important one always, is social norms and attitudes related to discrimination, racism, distrust of the government. All of that, again, contributing to the stress that people have. And, obviously one easy way that people can deal with it is to simply get a hold of marijuana or drugs. Exposure to crime, violence, and social disorder can lead to all sorts of mental health issues, different socioeconomic conditions like concentrated poverty and just all the stress that comes with it. And then maybe not having access to mass media and technology, that's a big part of it. Unfortunately, there can be a lot of issues related to that, and especially now with the current situation where you really need to have all of that. And then certainly like culture, language, literacy can all be related. Okay, so we have a question in the chat, but other than the perception of harm issues and access, what are some other major risk factors for youth in Fresno County? So how common is parental marijuana use amongst those youth who choose to use marijuana? So what is unfortunate about all of that is that oftentimes there is something where parents are indoctrinating their youth. It's not something that's super frequent, but I have heard stories and had people approach me after presentations when they want to really go in depth on the topic and talk about how there's foster children that have come from a home of 10 kids, and unfortunately in order to be a part of that family, you really had to be in the marijuana culture and you're indoctrinated at an early age. And I keep hearing that more and more and more, unfortunately. So there's a lot of different things that come up like that. There's many risk factors that lead to all of this. I kind of covered a lot of them in this, but just your access to health issues or to health services and that sort of thing. Okay, so the question is, why do young people use marijuana? What's the purpose of that? What are they getting out of it? Well, there's a lot of reasons. It could be just simple curiosity. It could be peer pressure. Again, they're hearing a lot about this stuff without ever having to leave their home, just in their phone. A lot of times they just want to fit in. They could have untreated mental health issues. So there could be depression, anxiety, anything like that using marijuana may even increase. And then you have youth that may have experienced trauma and stress. That's a big part of it. Again, maybe PTSD or just living in a bad neighborhood. There's all sorts of reasons that could happen. If they're already using alcohol and tobacco, their risk of using marijuana can increase. And then this can even just be a coping mechanism for like anger, boredom, again, depression, different things like that. You'd be surprised how many youth report that they just wanted to try marijuana. It was some kind of combination of boredom and curiosity. And then if you're high, it's a really easy way for you to avoid the problems and challenges of growing up. If you're having issues or you're having things going on at school or things going on social media. I mean, for example, I've even worked with a youth that they, because of the social media presence that they had and because of some of the backlash or something that happened on there, they actually ended up breaking up with their girlfriend because of something that happened on social media without them ever having left the house, and just because people made comments, and that led to a great deal of stress for them. And I can see how that would very easily lead to somebody going down the path of substance use. So really important parentally to try and be a role model. Remember that you're your child's first teachers and role models. So everything is really important and contributes to the influence that drugs will have in your life. Okay, so just kind of a little quiz that we would normally do, but who is most likely to introduce your child to drugs and alcohol? How long before a parent knows that they're using drugs? And what's the main reason why they would choose not to use drugs? So we'll cover the answers to that on the next slide. Okay, so interviews actually show that parents of teens that have encountered drug addiction can show that it can take 2 years for them to find out, which is really surprising, unfortunately. In this day and age, with the way vaping is and the nature of it, so that it can be hidden both with the smell and the appearance of vapes and how they look like everyday items, it can really be easy for them to hide their marijuana use, particularly if they're using that way. And maybe if they don't have proper supervision or spend extra time other places than home, or if mom and dad have to work late, all those sorts of things. Research also shows that for students that don't use alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, it's because of their parents' positive influence, and they knew they would disappoint them by using. So it's pretty important for parents to know and to feel empowered that they are the maybe thought that is going through that child's mind before they decide to take that joint or take a hit off the vape or whatever it is. Maybe that is that last thought is like, oh, but mom would be so sad that I did this, or how am I going to tell her? Or what if dad finds out? And those sorts of things would go through their head. So feel empowered. And then as for where young people typically get their marijuana, it's all over the place, but really friends tends to be a big one. This is oftentimes a social thing. Siblings can as well, like older siblings that might be of legal age or just are older and have been using for a while. I mentioned it earlier, but young people getting marijuana from their parents is actually 12%. So to me, that seems really high. And as a parent, that's very alarming, just even then that has any kind of percentage points at all associated with it. But there are families and there are instances where they're indoctrinated at an early age, or maybe if the parents are the ones that are using the marijuana, maybe they don't even intend for the children to get it, but they do, and that can lead to them starting at an early age as well. So yeah, lots of even adult family members, maybe grandpa or uncle or whoever it happens to be. But again, this is a large percentage of the time. And you'll notice that this percentage will not add up to 100. It's much more than that because this was a multiple choice, check all that apply type question. There's still even adult strangers buying it yourself, all kinds of different things. And some still didn't know, which is interesting. Okay. So unfortunately, the age of first use tends to be right around 13. We have found that as we've done our presentations and done our work, as we've surveyed students over the years, that number has gone up, which is a good thing. It used to be much more close to 13 years old exactly. And the fact that it's gone up at all in the midst of marijuana legalization and all the different things that happen politically with that is really a good thing, that it's at least on the rise instead of on the way down, that they're starting to use at least a slightly older age. Parent involvement is huge, but really it's a coin flip as to whether or not parents have talked to their youth about marijuana. Only 52% in the last 12 months said this with our last completed school year survey. And then related to accessibility, 59% of Fresno County youth thought that it was easy to get marijuana, whether that's fairly easy or very easy. So whatever way you slice it, most youth, nearly 2/3, don't seem to have a hard time. And again, I think those that didn't even make that attempt would probably have an easy time getting access to marijuana. Okay, so THC, this is the chemical that gets you high in marijuana, is the long and short of it. So there are more than 500 chemicals in marijuana, and THC is the one that causes the mind-altering effects. So when people use it, when they smoke it, it kind of goes straight to all the different vital organs of the body, and particularly the brain. So THC amounts have really changed over the years. It used to be right around 1% in the early 70s. That was kind of like with the hippies and the flower power and all of that stuff. And it's been hybridized over time to where the THC in the plants has been bred together to be really strong. And so we find that in Fresno County, that amount is significantly more, sometimes up to 30%. And we'll talk about some of the concentrated stuff in a moment. So we're going to talk about vaping because that's kind of where marijuana crosses over into being a different form of use. So some misconceptions that people have is that some vapes contain only flavors, which is not true at all. It's a conception that youth have where they think that, oh, well, I'm just vaping flavor and it's not a big deal. And so they think that they're not getting any kind of drug inside of it. But really, when a lot of tobacco control companies have tested out some of the vapes that claim to be nicotine free, they find that they contain nicotine at a very high rate. So this seems to be a bit of a trick on the people from the tobacco industry yet again. That vaping is safe and harmless. That's clearly not true. Before we were in the kind of the situation that we're in now, there was a vaping epidemic happening. And young people were vaping, and people really of any age were vaping THC and all sorts of different substances, and some of them were even dying from it. So it being safe and harmless is just simply off the table. And even the risk that you take using a vape in and of itself, sometimes they're made cheaply or they get real hot real fast. Sometimes the material inside can melt down and enter your stomach and cause severe problems that way. They do catch on fire and explode from time to time. It just depends on kind of the quality. And even people that I have known have been carrying their vape around in their pocket and it simply falls apart when they go to take it out. So a lot of times they can be not very well made or come apart easily. Vaping releasing harmless water vapor is also not true. What comes out is aerosol gas. And so that differs from water vapor in that Water vapor is what you come out of the shower and it's all misty and foggy in there, and the mirror's fogged up and whatnot. That's water vapor that eventually goes away. But aerosol gas is like what's inside of spray paint or cologne or perfume or even hairspray, and it leaves a residue if it gets onto the skin, and that can be harmful as well. And then vaping marijuana is safer than using tobacco. That's also a misconception, and it seems like there is a unfortunate lethal component when you get that aerosol into your lungs that can be fatal, and the same thing with tobacco as well. Okay, we have a question. Do you feel like parents don't educate kids because they don't know about it? That's a really good question. So I think parents don't educate their kids because they have a perception that marijuana is what it used to be. And that's kind of what I talked about with the potency, is that the parents have grown up in a time when marijuana wasn't as strong as it was. And nowadays it's a very different drug. There's this perception that, you know, people just lay down on the couch and go to sleep or play video games or order a pizza. And that's not necessarily always the case. With today's marijuana, it can be incredibly potent and it can cause severe psychological issues, quite frankly. So I think that they think it's the drug of old when really it's a new modern thing that they're not experienced with when they might have tried it when they were in high school or middle school. Okay, so some continuing on with kind of vaping. So there's these preloaded cannabis oil vape cartridges that are out there that make it a lot easier for youth to be able to use. And so when these already have the substance that you want to use inside of them, and for example, this is the concentrated marijuana that's called wax or dabs or hash oil, and this can be, you know, 80 to 100% THC. So it's a concentrated version and it can be extremely, extremely potent. And the reason the dab word exists is because a dab of it will get you high, is kind of the way that that was created. And so just a little tiny bit of this stuff, and unfortunately it really can have a severe effect on a developing mind. So we have these preloaded ones that are disposable even, and they're portable, they're functional, they're discreet, they're really easy to sort of deal with if you're a young person. Okay, so I mentioned that kids used to use this to cope with like depression and anxiety. And what about people that say that marijuana is a more natural way than psychotropic meds? So it's interesting because, I don't know, marijuana, while in a lot of ways it's probably not as harmful as, like, say, opiates and things like that, it's something that is going to harm you and really endanger someone's brain and quality of life later on. So a lot of times what we find is that it's called the dropout drug in some circles. And while marijuana in and of itself may not have like kind of the lethal effects that some of the prescription opiates have, and certainly that's a big deal, it really affects your brain and affects your functioning in that way. And if you're going to be going through life and kind of being compromised in that way, where your judgment and your memory and your decision making and whatnot, that's really a big deal. All right, some more questions. So some long-term impacts on the brain on adults who began using as a teen. Some of those can include intelligence, actually. So they've been able to prove on paper that if you use marijuana extensively over time for adults, that you actually lose IQ points. And so while this is not something that's guaranteed, it's something that certainly is possible. So they found that you can lose up to 8 IQ points over time for an adult. And then another question about, if marijuana is so bad, then why do doctors write prescriptions for them? So they actually don't write prescriptions, they write recommendations. Recommendations are different in that a prescription, you can hold a doctor like legally accountable for the prescription that they're writing you. So if you're overprescribed Vicodin or you're overprescribed Tylenol with codeine or something like that, and it's the doctor's fault that you had some sort of bad reaction to it, then they can actually be held accountable with medical malpractice. But doctors actually recommend marijuana in different ways, and it actually takes away all of that liability. It's sort of you taking on the risk instead of the doctor. And so it's a real big deal, and people do seem to really gravitate towards getting these recommendations. This is the way that people would get marijuana before they had access to it recreationally, was to kind of manipulate the medical marijuana system a little bit. But it's a very interesting question. Okay, we have another. Does the general public feel that marijuana is a gateway drug? What's the public attitude that we encounter? So it does seem like the general public still feels that way. I would say in sort of the circles that are more academic and scientific that we've gotten away from that a little bit. If you ask me, it's more of both, where if you encounter someone who has used harder drugs like heroin or meth or things like that, and you ask them, did you use marijuana earlier on in your journey? It's almost all the time is going to be yes. And the same thing with tobacco and the same thing with alcohol, those other drugs that are considered gateway drugs. So yeah, I think it definitely is, and it definitely can possibly lead to, or at least lead to the risk of going on to other drugs. But at the same time, it is its own problem. There's no denying that. And the stats in our county bear that out, where there are more young people that are in treatment for just marijuana use alone than anything else. That's the drug that seems to get them stuck and stopped and having the most problems. Okay, so some long-term effects, kind of like I was mentioning earlier. Certainly when you're putting anything in your lungs, be it aerosol or smoke of any kind, it doesn't even matter what kind of smoke, you're going to have respiratory and lung problems, so related to your breathing system, right? There's a lot of your immune system that's also housed in the lung, and so that can be compromised as well. We do find that people that use marijuana more extensively will be more sick more often, have more upper respiratory infections, use more sick days at work, be absent from work more often, things of that nature. And then we do have increased risk for mental health problems. I talked about that. There does seem to be an association with bipolar and schizophrenia between. It needs to be explored further, but it does seem like there may be some significant association there. And then marijuana addiction is a big part of this. I mentioned that earlier, but there are a lot of youth that are in our county that are unfortunately addicted, or at least feel like they are, where they stop and they start again and they can't quit. And they need to enter treatment for that. And for the amount that are in treatment, I can't imagine how many more probably might need to be. Okay, we have another question. Okay. So it's interesting because most people did indeed start with those 3 drugs that I mentioned. If they become an addict at some point later in life, or maybe even with one of those. So between tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana, they're certainly all gateway drugs, and I don't think you can necessarily deny that. And certainly there are, people that become alcoholics and people that become addicted to nicotine and marijuana and whatnot. All right, we will move forward. So a lot of effects on school life. Marijuana use can result in a lot of different things. So possibly lower grades, reduced coping skills, reduced persistence. So this is related to your motivation and your drive for accomplishment. Before I go further, I would also like to mention that when I talk about a lot of these things, I know I've mentioned the risk of it, that this is not all a certainty. If you use marijuana and you're a student, you're not certainly going to have lower grades, or you're not certainly going to have lower coping skills or reduced persistence. It means the risk that you're taking by using that drug. So it's not what happens to you definitely, it's what happens to most people most of the time. And that's why this is something that we cover. But it's not a guarantee or anything like that. I get approached by people who like to say, well, I'm a 4.0 student and I smoke weed every day and things like that. And I do get approached with that. And that's fine. They're making their own choices. But ultimately, I would argue that what is it that you could be doing even further than what you're doing now? Maybe there's some other potential that you have that you're not fully accomplishing because you are compromising your brain by using marijuana, especially when you're younger. So I just wanted to mention that. Psychological issues we've kind of covered a little bit already. Your reduced ability to learn and remember information. This is obviously huge in a school setting when you need to remember information for tests and you need to be taking in lots of different information so that you're prepared for all the things that you're going to face in school. And so your ability to learn and remember is school. That's the key thing. And so marijuana seems to attack that, unfortunately, that particular part of the brain. So in fact, we can see that there's lower graduation rates for both high school and college. And you could even be risking a loss of tuition money and financial aid due to the status of marijuana being federally illegal. If you're using any kind of tuition money or financial aid that's from a federal source, and you were using marijuana, say, on a college campus or something like that in federal housing, you could potentially look at losing that funding. And that has happened to people before. Okay, so just some warning signs for substance use. It can be challenging to figure out if they're using. We talked about earlier that it might take even up to 2 years. So these are some warning signs that are from drugfree.org, but shifts in mood and personality are a big part of it. Behavior changes is probably the one that I would point to most often. It does seem like when a young person maybe starts using, their behavior certainly changes. The way that they act and maybe even the things that they do. Perhaps they're involved in sports or clubs or extracurriculars like that. And unfortunately, sometimes they'll drop some of that stuff, or maybe they want to hang out with people that are also using, whether they're smoking marijuana or vaping or whatever it happens to be. That's kind of the key one that I would be looking at is who are they hanging out with and how is the behavior changing. Hygiene and appearance can be different. This can include like clothing changes. Maybe they're suddenly representing marijuana in some subtle or maybe even not so subtle way with t-shirts or shoes or things hanging off their backpack. It can be any number of things. They might not be taking care of their hygiene as much and also their physical health. So maybe they're coughing more, different things like that. So follow some of these tips like using your nose, being able to smell out if there's something different going on as far as maybe they are smoking marijuana somewhere or vaping. You might be able to detect some of that. Look at their eyes. Their eyes give away whether they've been using or not, unless they've been eating it, which is different. And just watch their behavior. All right, so we will go to some more questions. So interesting, maybe they had some IQ to burn, referring to my question about the IQ later, but they were smarter before. So what can a parent do or say to a child who doesn't want to stop or can't stop? That's a really hard one. It's unfortunate. And I think that they need to seek out treatment if they can't stop. That's the one that kind of caught my attention. We're going to give out some resources later on here that are going to detail the organization that we refer to when we hear about somebody who might be addicted to marijuana, which unfortunately is a frequent occurrence both at community events and presentations. We tend to get pulled to the side, or somebody's uncle, somebody's cousin, somebody's brother is addicted, or sounds like they are, at least according to this person we're speaking to. And we like to have a way to be able to refer them out to treatment because that's not what we do. We're in prevention. And so fortunately, we're able to do that. And if they won't stop, unfortunately, that's going to be something that is going to be a part of their journey where maybe you're going to be able to reach them through somebody else. Maybe you as the parent is not necessarily the right path at that moment, and maybe through counseling or somebody that they trust or through their friends. But if they won't stop, inevitably it's their life and their choices, and people that use are going to use if they really, really want to, as we know. Okay, so in 2016, California passed Prop 64, which made marijuana legal for recreational use for those that are 21 and over. And it's interesting to think about how is it that you would talk to your youth about a drug that used to be illegal, but now is, and society has clearly accepted it, like say tobacco or alcohol. So you can say something effective, although it's still illegal for you to use recreational marijuana, it's important that us as parents and caregivers recognize that young people are going to try it. They're going to be exposed to marijuana at some point, and sometimes as early as elementary school, which is a sad fact, but we do see cases from time to time in elementary. So it's something that you're going to have to deal with one way or another. It's something that I think about with my kids, and you're going to have to be prepared for that. We'll talk a little bit more about how that works. Okay, so we have a question that I've heard some people say they actually function better while under the influence. What makes marijuana make them feel like they're doing better? Yeah, I think people get so used to using, and they maybe convince themselves that this is just their life now. And I feel like when I do talk to people that are actively using marijuana, that it seems like they don't see very far outside of their little zone, and their life is kind of shrunk down. And I think we know with addiction and whatnot, your focus narrows to that drug that you're using. And so for them, I kind of describe it as a fog or a haze that they're living in where they can't see much outside of it. And if I try to tell them anything about marijuana's harmful effects, or trying to educate, say a student at a school that seems like they're really interested in marijuana or outright tells me that they're using it, and I try and tell them anything negative about it or anything that's, going to affect their health negatively, they really have a interesting response, often not good. And they just seem like they literally can't accept it. So I think that's a lot of people convincing themselves, unfortunately. Yeah, so clearly dopamine being released is a big part of that. So a lot of times, just going on to another question about anxiety, people think that anxiety and depression are helped by marijuana use. But what we find is that people that are anxious and depressed, they often find marijuana. They're often anxious and depressed as they're using it. And when they quit, guess what? They're still anxious and depressed. It really points at an underlying mental health issue. Yeah, so, and we mentioned that research shows that marijuana can increase anxiety over time. Okay, so this is kind of the more you ask mindset, but what we really want parents to be able to think about is having an open mind. And what we would have you strive for, especially with your younger children, is that you can try and have an open, loving, close relationship where when the time comes when maybe there is some, your child is starting to use, that maybe even if they do start and they do experiment, that maybe they would actually come to you and say, you know what, I tried this today, or felt like I had to, or I was just curious and whatever. And maybe they would actually feel comfortable enough to tell you about it. And you guys could kind of move forward in a very kind of open-minded sort of way. So it's something that may be hard to think about, and it's going to be hard to restrain your own emotion. But if you can have that relationship that's already built in, that's supportive and warm and loving and open, you have a big advantage going forward, just like I said, because they're going to be exposed to marijuana at some point or another, almost certainly. So you want to be clear kind of with your expectations and what you have in mind for them. You don't want the waters to be muddy where they think that it would be okay to use potentially. You want to make sure that they understand your policy on it. You want to try and be in their shoes. I think now more than ever, there's more drugs out there, more drug access, and it's easier to get than any other time, in my opinion. And try to be in their shoes. It's tough to be a young person now. We all, a lot of people didn't grow up with social media and some of the pressures that they have, and try to really think about what it's like to be them these days in particular. And rather than sitting down and having kind of a formal conversation, which is okay, and that depends on your relationship and your kid, but you might be able to look for opportunities to start a conversation about marijuana use where maybe you pass a dispensary, or maybe you see an advertisement, or maybe you hear one. Maybe something comes up on your social media or theirs, and you can have a natural opportunity to start a conversation about this that might be more productive than one that's more just like you sit on the couch and I sit on the couch and we talk about this. You might have that kind of relationship, but you might not. And looking for an opportunity to start the conversation that way would be best. Okay, so consequences of edibles being less severe than smoking marijuana. Yeah, I would say probably not. With edibles, there's an element to it where, unfortunately, when people take an edible, they do have a tendency to overdo it, because a lot of times the edible dosage is stated, but not something that people follow. So perhaps if you have a cookie or a soda or a brownie or whatever it happens to be, you're supposed to take one, what would be equivalent to one small bite or something like that. And people tend to just want to have a cookie or a brownie or what have you, or maybe they're impatient, or maybe they think that they're heavyweight and they can handle these sorts of things. But what's unfortunate is that that can cause people to really be severely affected by the edible. And so because it manifests itself differently in your gastrointestinal tract, all of that THC tends to go to the brain at the same time once digested. And so that can cause severe psychological issues. There have been a number of things related to suicide and to severe mental health kind of psychoses that do happen. So it's unfortunate. So a good age to start talking to your children would be, I don't know if I can put a number on it, but I would treat it like, if they can understand, it depends on where they're at. I would meet them where they're at. But if you think they can start to understand what you're talking about, then I would begin to have the conversation, because you're going to make that a norm, that it's okay to talk about drugs with your parents. And it is, and it should be, but it's going to have to start earlier rather than start all of a sudden when they're starting to use. You got to be proactive. We're in prevention here, and we would encourage that. So whatever age you think they can start to understand, I wouldn't want to put a number on it, though. It's going to be up to you and your child. Is there a list of guiding questions that can help parents start the conversation? Yes, we have actually in a separate presentation a list of ways that you can start the conversation. So you'd be able to contact us to get that. Okay, so this is a small sample of that I just referred to, but we have a more extensive list. So how to begin? So open-ended questions is best. Yes or no questions doesn't really get you anywhere. You just get a yes or no. You want to start a conversation, not have a question answered. So you could say something like, tell me more about what you're seeing at school, or tell me more about what you're seeing online, different things like that. And like I said, there's natural opportunities sometimes too, where you can try and take advantage of those, especially if you're in the car or something like that. So don't judge. This is a big part of it. Listen and offer empathy and compassion. This is probably what's going to be toughest as a parent, because I think most of our knee-jerk reactions as parents is going to be upset or to be angry because they might have experimented or tried marijuana. And trying to not judge and listen and be empathetic and be compassionate and try and understand the situation for what it is, rather than this, sort of violation of your policy or your morals or your values or what have you. It'd be a lot better to be empathetic and compassionate. So building that trusting relationship where they feel safe and they actually feel like they can talk to you about this, even though they feel like you might not want to hear it, that would be a really big deal. And this is kind of the optimal. This is what we're going for here. And be patient. It may take a while for them to feel comfortable telling you the truth about maybe some things they're seeing or doing. But if you let them lead the conversation, then a lot of times you get a lot more out of it than you trying to, sort of grill them in a way. That's not going to be the best way to go about it often. They'll feel safer if they can feel like they can say what they want to when they want to. So just some information about understanding the brain, but the parts of the adolescent brain that develop first are those responsible for physical coordination, emotion, motivation, but the part of the brain that controls reasoning, impulses, which is the prefrontal cortex, doesn't fully mature until 25. So in other words, there's a long way to go for all that stuff that really they need as they're physically able to do some of these risky things like using marijuana. They're maybe not emotionally and logically able to handle them. And so this is why this is such a risky time. So talking about risk, so the adolescent brain is certainly wired for risky behavior because of that. They're big enough and strong enough to do what they want to do, but maybe they're not emotionally mature enough to handle it. And so there's always going to be those risk-taking kind of behaviors in young people. It's important to channel it into physical activity, career exploration, family outings, those sorts of things. So, and if you have a family history of drug use, then your risk kind of increases inherently. And remember, again, you're your child's first role model. You're their first teacher. You can model the right kinds of things to do from the start. So just some tips for ways that you can help out with your child. You can try and ensure that they sleep well. I mean, this can be tough, but getting onto a good routine and having clear expectations as to, how late we can stay up and when we get up in the morning to get ready and things like that. If they're not actively involved in exercise, maybe getting them involved in some way, whether they're in sports or on their own exercise program. Being able to talk things out. We've talked about that throughout, but if you have a standard that like each day you kind of download and talk about things, and maybe it's, a little bit less formal, or maybe it is something where you're at the dinner table and you have a conversation about how the day went, that's great. But talking it out is a big part of this. Even having like just quiet time and fun time as well, where, you're not necessarily trying to get anything accomplished or do a bunch of work or whatever, and not anything loud, but just having time for fun, having time for quiet is a big thing and good for the adolescent brain. Getting outside time can kind of go along with exercise. It's been proven that learning mindfulness can help a lot of teens as well. And then journaling is a big part of being able to get out some of those emotions and some of those feelings and writing it down. So again, parents are role models. And according to SAMHSA, parents and caring adults are the most powerful tool that's evidenced by the research, and realize the power that you have to influence their behavior. I referenced it earlier on when the biggest reason that youth self-report why they don't use drugs is their parental disappointment. They fear that they're going to disappoint their parents. That just shows directly how big of an influence you have. So this is a parent tip that we like to throw out there. It's called a code word strategy. And it's important that when they are starting to go out and about and do social things and be at friends' houses or different things like that, that if they get themselves into trouble or they find themselves in a bad situation, maybe suddenly everybody's using marijuana, or maybe there's gang activity happening, or maybe the situation is violent or unsafe in some way, that you can have them call home and have this all prearranged, but they call your cell phone or home or whatever it is, and you just have a code word that they use where you don't ask any questions and you come and pick them up from wherever they are. And so that code word can just simply be like, Mom, I don't feel good, or I feel sick. And you say, okay, where are you? And that's it. You go to wherever they are, you pick them up and you bring them home. You don't grill them about what they're doing or why they're there or why they broke the rules or anything like that. You just simply go and take them, and then it offers the opportunity for a conversation maybe on the ride back or on the way back or at a later time. But this makes them feel like that you're the safe place in maybe an unsafe situation that they found themselves in. And just real quickly, I touched on it earlier, but marijuana's legal status is important. So for City of Fresno, we don't quite have the dispensaries open yet, but that was something that was passed a while back. And we'll probably see that at some point with dispensaries being in the 7 voting districts. Marijuana is legal for adults 21 over for all of California, unless there's some restrictions in place. But as far as just use for 21 and over, that applies to the whole state. But again, that's 21 over, not for anyone before that. And then again, marijuana is federally illegal, and it continues to be a substance on the Schedule 1 list. Some resources, I referenced one of them earlier, but if you're struggling or your child won't stop using or can't stop, and maybe they do actually want some help, and even if they don't, you might want to be able to contact Transitions Children's Services, ProMesa Outpatient for some counseling, and here's a bunch of different resources from SAMHSA and Healthy Children and different places like that that you might be able to utilize. Okay, and for more information from us, if you wanted to get an extended list of ways to start the conversation or anything like that, you can contact us with this information here. So do we have any other questions at this time?